Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be amongst all of you. Rob, congratulations. And it's great to meet you. And I have so many questions. We only have 20 minutes, so we're going to have to just burn through it. But you are now in the private sector, and you do global strategic risk consulting. You're a busy, busy man. Tell us what the biggest risk is, if you can boil it down to, for the United States right now.
Sure. So first...
Just one.
That's an easy question. I'm glad to start off with a softball. So let me sort of, maybe not for the United States, but let me sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about some of the biggest geopolitical risks and trends that I see on the horizon, or already, some of them already closer to home than we might like. So a number of things. First, we see that power is diffusing within the international system. So power, which was normally held primarily within advanced industrialized democracies, is now diffusing to other middle powers and emerging markets. That's fine. A second issue is that we're seeing more and more conflicts worldwide. So the University of Uppsala in Sweden has this conflicts tracker that has looked at the number of armed conflicts worldwide since the 1960s. You have a fairly steady baseline from the beginning of the tracker until about the early 2010s. And then the graph really starts to accelerate. So conflicts are increasing. Third, we're seeing an attenuation of both institutions and norms. So institutions like the United Nations, like the organization where I worked, the OSCE, or the WTO, but then also norms, whether it's the Geneva Conventions or international humanitarian law more generally. And then finally, I see a trend that has really sort of taken hold in the last decade or so, which is the erosion of the boundary between domestic politics and geopolitics. So you find increasingly that domestic political contests are being projected into the geopolitical arena, and at the same time that nation states are interfering in the affairs of other states, if you will, to change the pieces on the geopolitical chessboard. So I find that the combination of these four factors, increasing conflict, attenuation of norms, and more meddling in the affairs of other states, to be a very worrisome set of trends. And I think it impacts the United States.
Who's doing the most meddling? Who is the one that is sticking their nose in where they don't belong the most?
Well, so you typically find this, that sounds like a leading question. The United States, so let me back up. The United States, Russia, China certainly are the leading powers that are interfering in the politics of other countries. But I want to underscore that for the United States, this is really a new phenomenon. It used to be, when I joined the Foreign Service, probably around the same time as Christina, that secretaries of state would not travel to a foreign country when they're about to have an election. We wouldn't want to be seen as somehow influencing one party or candidate or another. Today, we have the Secretary of State not only travel to Hungary,
And the Vice President.
But endorse a candidate for Prime Minister in the heat of the election season. That's something that never used to happen in the past. So it's the United States, it's Russia, primarily on its periphery, but also in other countries, including ours, and China to a lesser degree, but also a step maybe behind Russia.
What do you think is going to happen in Hungary with the new leader, Magyar? And how is that? Because obviously, Vance goes there to send a message back home, correct? That to his supporters, would-be supporters in 2028. Now that that didn't work out so well for him with the election, what do you think that is going to portend, both for domestic and for foreign policy in Hungary? Do you think the Trump administration will say, Hungary, no, that's okay, we're not into you anymore?
I think the foremost consequence of Magyar's election is that the European Union now has a little bit more cohesion. Orban was sort of the bad boy of the European Union, vetoing support for Ukraine, withholding support for other critical foreign policy measures. Now that he has stepped aside, he's got this sidekick in Slovakia, Robert Fico, who also tends to adopt similar positions, but on his own, he's less likely to do so. So I think we can expect more cohesion to European Union policy. But when it comes to the United States, it's a pretty big blow to have the Secretary of State and the Vice President travel to a country and be so thoroughly repudiated by the electorate. So Magyar now has a constitutional majority of something like 68% of the seats in parliament, which will allow him to do wholesale change to the Orban system, mainly getting rid of all the corrupt cronies that Orban had installed over the last 16 years in power. But I don't see the U.S. Stepping back from its desire to interfere in the politics of other countries. And if you've seen the rhetoric around Cuba over the last couple of days, things are really heating up in Cuba, and the administration has made clear that they expect some sort of change, and we'll have to see, is it political, is it economic, is it both, in the coming weeks.
Raul Castro was just indicted today. Do you expect any military action in Cuba? What do you think? Don't you think we have our hands full at this moment? A little bit?
We most certainly do, and military action in Cuba would be the most likely thing to sort of galvanize anti-Americanism on an island where the population is very skeptical of the ruling Communist Party. There is potentially a deal to be made where the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, steps down. He's term limited. He's got 2 years left in office anyway. He steps down, and then potentially some economic reforms take root. But it's unclear to me if that's a deal that the Trump administration will take if it's offered, or whether the Cubans will accept such a deal. It may be that the two sides are headed for confrontation, and then gosh knows what happens.
What do you think is the true motivating factor there? Is it Marco Rubio's desire to see Cuba change significantly? What is actually driving the Trump administration with Cuba?
My view is, and this is just my view, but when the president came into office, I think he had a plan in foreign policy that saw a sort of a trifecta of events occurring over the course of his first 2 years in office. Removing Maduro from Venezuela, and they paved the way for that already with an executive order on the very first day that Trump was in office on January 20th of 2025, designating cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. The removal of Maduro then put Cuba in play because Cuba was dependent on its oil revenues coming from Venezuela. Once Maduro was no longer a factor, Cuba came into play. But then he decided as well that because Iran was historically weak, that there could be a trifecta by also taking out Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. Now, that hasn't gone so well. So, but again, I think that Cuba is in play, and in fact, the administration may see Cuba as a way to distract attention from the stalemate that we found ourselves in Iran.
Okay, but we can't avoid the effects of that stalemate, which is higher gas prices, for one, a global economy thrown into disarray. How long do you think the stalemate can continue?
My view is that markets and analysts and media are overestimating the ability of the administration to do a deal. I think this stalemate can continue for months to come, and it's not priced in. Remember at the beginning of the administration when President Trump said that he would solve the Ukraine-Russia war in 24 hours, and then months later said, boy, this was a lot harder than I initially thought it would be. Right now, the administration has really walked into a blind alley with Iran, and it doesn't really have a good way out. There is a ceasefire in place, but a lot of the commentators in the media have spoken about what the U.S. wants from Iran. So an end to the nuclear program, a reduction in Iran's capacity to harm its neighbors with drones and missiles, and a reduction in its ability to deploy proxies across the region. That's great. But from Tehran's perspective, what does Tehran want right now? Well, if I'm sitting in Tehran after the 12-day war that occurred last June, where the leadership decided to de-escalate quickly with the United States in order to avert bombing of their country, the primary priority right now is to what they call restore deterrence. It's a military term to impose such costs on the United States that it is inconceivable that the U.S. and Israel could carry out another bombing campaign in 12 months, in 2 years, or in 5 years. And so, in my view, and I'm not an Iran expert, but those who I talk to believe that the regime will continue to extract costs, primarily from the global economy, but also from the United States, for as long as they can,
and
in
how
order
long
to
would that be, do you
well,
think?
so right now it's a game of chicken, because the regime also faces the inability to export its oil, which is eventually going to cause economic shortages at home and potentially drastic ones where people are out in the streets. But the United States is now, we're going to reach $5 a gallon as a national average in the next.
A lot higher here.
A lot higher in California. Yes,
higher.
I realize that. In the next week or so, and then that crunch will continue, and it'll also feed into inflation and have broader macroeconomic impact. So it's a game of chicken, and it's unclear to me that Iran is going to be the first side to blink.
So Trump has tried to get the Europeans involved to open up the strait, and they're not terribly interested. He has waged a tariff war against Europe, amongst other countries. He has expressed some skepticism about remaining in NATO. He's kind of eyeing Greenland, you know. So things are going great in that relationship with Europe. I think that's like a love affair, right, between Europe and the United States. How do you assess what's happening between the United States and Europe? What is Europe? You're a Europeanist. What does Europe, what are they saying, the leaders of the European countries saying, and how are they, more importantly, realigning?
Well, there's been a lot of friction, as you just alluded to, in the transatlantic relationship since President Trump came into office. But I think all of it was more or less manageable until we got to the Greenland crisis in January of this year. It was simply surreal and unimaginable for our European allies that the United States, the linchpin of European defense and deterrence, would threaten the sovereignty of Denmark and Greenland. Denmark being a founding member of NATO and a very loyal ally that had offered the United States every aspect of basing or military access to Greenland. And so when the U.S. and Israel launched the war against Iran without consulting in advance with any of our European allies, the Europeans decided that they were going to sit this one out. And many of them also view the war as illegal under international law. It was not a war that was fought in self-defense. And so they are reluctant to get involved so long as the war is still not officially resolved. Now, they have an interest in trying to unblock the Strait of Hormuz, but the trust is not there. And so transatlantic relations, I've written recently, have sort of become like a prisoner's dilemma. It's in both sides' interests, which is a political science game theory, sorry to wonk out here, where when you have two sides and it's in the interest of both sides to cooperate, but they don't, and they repeatedly don't cooperate, it's what's called a prisoner's dilemma. And that's exactly the situation we find ourselves now in terms of transatlantic relations. So the Europeans are pissed off, and there's also a political calculus to this, because in Europe, it is now politically advantageous to counter the United States. Look at all the European politicians who have stood up to President Trump, whether it's Pedro Sanchez in France, not in Europe, but Mark Carney in Canada, or Mette Frederiksen in Denmark. Their popularity has surged. So there is no one in Europe right now that is advocating for, aside from Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, that is advocating for, let's get involved in the Persian Gulf right now. They are making contingency plans, but not for now.
Eventually going to have to, economically?
If this drags on for another month or 2 or 3 or 4, I think Europeans are going to want to find a resolution as quickly as possible. The already oil prices in Europe are 50% higher than they were on February 27th, and the jet fuel crisis is intense. So they will want to find a solution to this, but the question is it's a collective action problem. What European country is going to want to send ships into the Strait of Hormuz when those ships are vulnerable to Iranian mines, speedboats, UAVs, uncrewed maritime vessels? The Iranians have tremendous asymmetric capabilities that they can deploy.
So it's going great in Iran for the United States and everyone else.
We said we were going to do something positive here.
Okay.
I'm still waiting for you to ask me the question where I can.
I'm trying. I'm trying to think about it. What's positive? The Olympics. The Olympics are. Yeah, right? We have the Olympics. What do you think? Can we all come together and celebrate that sport here in LA? We have a new subway line. Seriously, do you think all of this can be put back in the box? Let's say 2028 comes and there's a new administration with a different view. Do you think Europe can say, okay, we'll be friends again, forget those last 4 years, we're good?
So I think we're right now at an inflection point where, well, first of all, let me just say, I think Europeans and a lot of our Asian allies are concerned that what they're seeing right now in the United States is cyclical or structural to some degree and not episodic or not a one-off. So there is a lot of concern. But what I worry about is that we're at this inflection point where the Europeans now are making choices about their defense. They're making choices about their tech sector. They're making choices about their industrial policy. And they could build a bridge to the future for themselves that it goes in a 180 opposite direction from where the United States is going. And if enough time passes, then we may not be able to get back into a place where we're cooperating, and that $9.5 trillion economic relationship is torn asunder. Not completely, but that the supply chains are disentangled. That could happen if this continues for another couple of years. But it's hard to say. It's also possible that a new administration could patch a lot of this up, and that we could get back to cooperating on the core issues of security, of prosperity, of managing our alliance together.
Oh, I did think of a positive thing. AI. We are actually, well, maybe, I don't know. We're actually out of time, but, and I have not come up with anything positive aside from the Olympics. If you have something positive you'd like to end on, have at it.
Well, I think the good news is that a lot of countries around the world are managing the challenges they face today by constructing coalitions of the willing. In the trade domain, for example, our former trade rep, Mike Froman, has talked about a new polyamorous trading order where countries are getting together in multilateral formats to solve their trading problems. But, it's not it's not through the WTO. It's not multilateralism on a global scale. It's sort of smaller multilateral fora. And you see that now emerging on a range of issues, including support for Ukraine, which is sort of there's coalitions of the willing to arm Ukraine. So this appears to be a trend that is gaining popularity. And frankly, it's healthy that countries would find a way to work around those countries that don't want to work with them.
Who would that be? Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Ambassador Carpenter.